January 17, 1945. The Ardennes forest, Belgium. The snow fell in silence. Thick, relentless, blanketing the shattered trees and frozen earth in a shroud of white that muffled the world. Inside the cramped steel belly of a Panther tank, 5 men huddled against the cold that seeped through every rivet and weld. Obergefreiter Klaus Meyer pressed his face against the periscope, his breath forming crystals on the glass. The forest stretched before him in twilight gray, skeletal branches clawing at a sky heavy with the promise of more snow. Behind him, the loader rubbed his hands together, the friction barely generating warmth. The driver sat motionless, conserved energy his only defense against the numbing cold. They had been waiting for 3 hours, waiting for orders, waiting for fuel, waiting for a war that had already turned against them, though none dared speak it aloud. Then Meyer heard it, a sound that didn't belong to the forest's silence, not the crack of small arms fire they'd grown accustomed to, not the grinding of tank treads or the bark of German 88s. This was different, distant, rhythmic. A low rumble that seemed to come from the earth itself, rolling through the frozen ground like approaching thunder. He strained to identify it, his training catalog of sounds failing him. The rumble grew, deeper, more insistent. And then, in a moment that would crystallize in his memory forever, the first shell arrived. It didn't whistle. It didn't scream. It simply appeared, a column of fire and earth erupting 200 meters to their left with a precision that defied everything he'd been taught about artillery. Before the debris settled, another shell landed. Then another, not in the scattered area saturation pattern of German or Soviet guns, but in a methodical, surgical sequence. Each explosion walked across the landscape with the measured pace of a man counting steps. This wasn't artillery as Meyer knew it. This was something else entirely. This was mathematics made manifest. This was American fire. The Wehrmacht had entered this war with a doctrine built on speed, shock, and the calculated application of combined arms. Blitzkrieg, the lightning war, had shattered Poland in weeks, brought France to its knees in days, and pushed deep into the Soviet heartland with what seemed like unstoppable momentum. German artillery, the foundation of their defensive doctrine in the First World War, had evolved into a mobile, responsive arm capable of devastating concentrations of fire. The Nebelwerfer rocket launchers could saturate entire grid squares with explosive fury. The 88 gun, originally designed for anti-aircraft work, had proven itself a tank killer without peer. German gunners were trained, disciplined, professional soldiers who understood the geometry of indirect fire and the art of timing. But what the Americans brought to the European battlefield was not merely an evolution of artillery doctrine. It was a revolution. It was the marriage of industrial abundance and scientific precision, of mechanical reliability and logistical excess, of democratic egalitarianism applied to the most ancient of military problems: how to destroy what you cannot see. The German tanker hearing that first American barrage in the Ardennes was not simply hearing superior firepower. He was hearing the sound of a different civilization, one that had taken the tools of war and subjected them to the same principles of efficiency and standardization that had given it assembly lines, supermarkets, and transcontinental highways. The men of the Wehrmacht had been told many things about their American adversaries. They had been told the Americans were soft, corrupted by material comfort and racial mongrelization. They had been told that American soldiers were unwilling to die for their cause, that they would break and run when faced with determined German resistance. They had been told that American equipment, while numerous, was inferior in quality to German engineering, mass-produced junk that would fail under the rigors of real combat. These narratives were not merely propaganda. They were necessary fictions that allowed German soldiers to reconcile their mounting losses with their sense of professional pride and ideological superiority. Klaus Meyer had believed some of these things, perhaps not with the fervor of a true believer, but with the casual acceptance that comes from hearing the same story told repeatedly by men in authority. He had seen captured American half-tracks and noted their simple construction, so different from the complex, over-engineered German vehicles. He had heard from other soldiers about Americans who surrendered readily, who valued their lives more than victory. He had been part of an army that, even in retreat, prided itself on tactical excellence and martial discipline. But now, crouched in his Panther tank as American shells walked across the forest with mechanical precision, those comfortable narratives began to dissolve like snow in warm rain. The thunder continued, shell after shell, not the frantic, desperate firing of an enemy trying to find its target through volume alone, but a measured, almost leisurely progression. Each explosion spoke of calculation. Each impact demonstrated control. Somewhere beyond the horizon, beyond the reach of his vision or his guns, American artillerymen were destroying his world with the dispassionate efficiency of factory workers on an assembly line. What Meyer could not see, what no German soldier trapped under that barrage could fully comprehend, was the system that generated such fire. The American artillery system of 1945 was not a single weapon or even a collection of weapons. It was an integrated network of observation, communication, calculation, and fire delivery that functioned with a reliability and speed that bordered on the uncanny. At its foundation lay a deceptively simple innovation: the Fire Direction Center. While German artillery relied on individual battery commanders making calculations based on maps, experience, and the imperfect information delivered by forward observers, the Americans had centralized and mechanized the process. When an American forward observer spotted a target, he radioed coordinates to a fire direction center, not to a single battery, but to a coordination hub that could task multiple batteries, even entire battalions, within seconds. Officers armed with mechanical calculators, standardized charts, and precise meteorological data would compute firing solutions with a speed and accuracy that German observers initially attributed to luck. But this wasn't luck. This was the application of American organizational genius to the problem of indirect fire. The shells falling around Meyer's tank came from M114-155 howitzers positioned kilometers behind the American lines. Each gun weighed over 7,000 pounds, but American logistics had made them as mobile as rifle companies. Trucks towed them into position. Pre-positioned ammunition dumps ensured they never ran dry. Standardized procedures meant that green crews and veteran crews operated with nearly identical efficiency. And underpinning it all was a logistical infrastructure so vast, so redundantly capable, that it seemed to defy the very concept of supply shortage. Every American artillery battalion in Europe fired the same ammunition, used the same firing tables, operated on the same radio frequencies. A forward observer from one division could call fire from any battalion within range, knowing that the response would come with the same speed and precision regardless of which unit answered. This interoperability, this fungibility of units and materiel, represented a philosophical approach to warfare that was quintessentially American. German units, by contrast, were often optimized for specific roles, equipped with specialized equipment that could not be easily replaced or transferred. German excellence came from expertise and specialization. American power came from standardization and abundance. Inside the Panther, the crew felt each impact through the frozen ground. The tank's 50 tons of armor and steel transmitted every shockwave directly into their bodies. The loader had stopped trying to warm his hands. The driver gripped his controls as if they could somehow protect him. The gunner stared at his sights, knowing they were useless against an enemy that could strike from beyond the horizon. And Meyer, his face still pressed to the periscope, watched the forest transform into a landscape of fire and shattered timber. Then the pattern changed. The methodical walk of shells stopped. For 10 seconds, an eternity when every nerve is screaming, there was silence. Meyer allowed himself the dangerous luxury of hope. Perhaps the barrage was over. Perhaps the Americans had expended their ammunition. Perhaps. The world exploded, not in sequence but simultaneously. Dozens of shells arrived in a single, catastrophic moment. The technique would later be called time on target, a method by which multiple batteries fired at different times, their shells calculated to arrive at the target simultaneously regardless of distance. It was a mathematical marvel, a demonstration of coordination that required precise timing, reliable communication, and absolute confidence in one's calculations. For the men on the receiving end, it was apocalyptic. The Panther rocked on its suspension. Shrapnel hammered against the armor with the sound of 1,000 hammers striking steel. The radio operator screamed something that was lost in the noise. Meyer's vision went white as a shell landed close enough to shower the tank with frozen earth and splintered wood. The air itself seemed to compress, to solidify, to press against them with physical force. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the barrage. It was the silence of stunned senses and damaged hearing. It was the silence of men checking their bodies for wounds they couldn't feel through the adrenaline. It was the silence of a forest that had ceased to exist, replaced by a lunar landscape of craters and smoking debris. Meyer's hands shook as he gripped the periscope. His training had prepared him for combat. It had not prepared him for this. This was not combat. This was industrial slaughter delivered from a distance with the impersonal efficiency of a slaughterhouse. The Panther's radio crackled to life. The company commander's voice, tight with controlled panic, ordered all surviving tanks to fall back to secondary positions. There would be no counterattack. There would be no glorious stand. There would be only retreat. The bitter mathematics of survival against an enemy that could see everything and strike anything with a precision that seemed to mock the very concept of fog of war. As the driver coaxed the Panther's engine to life and the tank began its withdrawal through the shattered forest, Meyer understood something that would have been unthinkable months earlier. The Germans were not losing because they lacked courage. They were not losing because their soldiers were inferior. They were losing because they had gone to war with a nation that had turned warfare itself into an industrial process, a nation that could afford to fire 10,000 shells to kill 10 men and consider it an acceptable exchange. The thunder he had heard approaching was not merely artillery. It was the sound of American abundance weaponized, of logistical superiority transformed into tactical dominance. The numbers told a story that German soldiers experienced as terror, but that military historians would later analyze with clinical detachment. In the final year of the war in Europe, American artillery units fired over 30 million rounds of ammunition. 30 million. Each round weighing dozens of pounds, each round requiring its own propellant charge, each round manufactured, shipped across an ocean, transported to the front, and stored in dumps that stretched for acres. The logistical achievement alone beggared comprehension, but it was not mere quantity that made American artillery fearsome. It was the precision with which that quantity could be applied. German artillery doctrine emphasized massed fires, concentrating multiple batteries on a single target to achieve devastating effect. This required time to coordinate, careful planning, and communication networks that were increasingly disrupted by Allied air superiority. American artillery, by contrast, could achieve the same concentration of fire in minutes rather than hours. A forward observer with a radio and a map could unleash the fury of an entire division's guns on a target the size of a city block. And he could do so while under fire himself, confident that the system behind him would respond with mechanical reliability. The key to this responsiveness lay in an innovation that seemed mundane but was revolutionary in its implications. The proximity fuse. Traditional artillery shells exploded on contact or after a time delay. Gunners aimed to achieve airbursts, explosions above the target that rained shrapnel downward, but this required precise calculation of range and timing. A shell that burst too high was wasted. A shell that struck the ground before detonating was less effective. The proximity fuse, developed in absolute secrecy and deployed for troops in trenches or foxholes, for tank crews who had learned to shelter behind their vehicles, the proximity fuse was a nightmare. There was no safety in the ground. The shells found you anyway, bursting overhead with mechanical certainty. Klaus Meyer would never learn the technical details of the proximity fuse. He would never understand the mathematics of the fire direction center or the logistical systems that kept American guns supplied with ammunition when German units were rationing their shells. But he didn't need to understand the system to experience its effects. Every German soldier who survived an American barrage carried with them the visceral knowledge that they were fighting an enemy that possessed resources beyond comprehension, that could afford to expend materiel with a lavishness that seemed almost insulting in its excess. This abundance became a symbol, not merely of American industrial capacity, but of a fundamental difference in how the two societies approached war itself. German military culture valorized the soldier who could do more with less, who could turn limited resources into tactical victories through superior skill and determination. The German tank ace who destroyed dozens of enemy tanks with a single vehicle, the infantryman who held a position against overwhelming odds with dwindling ammunition, these were the heroes of Wehrmacht mythology. They had to be. Germany's strategic situation demanded excellence as compensation for material inferiority. America, by contrast, had built a military doctrine that assumed abundance. American soldiers were taught to call for artillery support liberally, to request airstrikes as a matter of routine, to expend ammunition freely because more was always available. This was not wastefulness born of carelessness. It was a conscious strategic choice to trade material for lives, to use industrial capacity as a force multiplier that allowed American soldiers to fight with the knowledge that their nation's factories stood behind them. Every shell fired was a shell that didn't need to be shipped home. Every artillery barrage was an investment in bringing American soldiers home alive. The German tankers who survived encounters with American artillery carried stories back to their units. These stories spread through the Wehrmacht with the speed of all frontline rumors, gaining embellishment but losing none of their essential truth. They spoke of barrages that lasted hours without pause. They described the sound of American guns, so many firing simultaneously that individual explosions merged into a continuous roar. They told of the psychological weight of fighting an enemy that seemed to possess unlimited resources, that could afford to destroy an entire grid square to eliminate a single machine gun position. These stories eroded morale in ways that battlefield defeats could not. A soldier can accept tactical defeat while maintaining pride in his own performance. He can rationalize a retreat as a temporary setback. But how does a soldier maintain his sense of martial superiority when the evidence of his eyes and ears testifies daily to his enemy's overwhelming material advantage? How does ideology sustain itself in the face of such abundance? The winter of 1944–1945 was particularly brutal for German forces in the West. The failure of the Ardennes offensive, Hitler's last desperate gamble to split the Allied armies, had exhausted Germany's strategic reserves and left entire divisions stranded without fuel or supplies. As American and British forces pushed toward the Rhine, German units found themselves subjected to artillery barrages of increasing intensity and precision. Every crossroads, every bridge, every defensive position came under fire with a thoroughness that seemed to erase the very concept of safety behind the lines. American artillery forward observers became legendary figures among German troops, hated and feared in equal measure. These were often junior officers or enlisted men, equipped with little more than a radio, binoculars, and a map. Yet they wielded destructive power that exceeded that of entire German regiments. They could see a target, a tank, a supply column, a command post, and within minutes bring down fire from guns positioned kilometers away. They adjusted fire with calm professionalism, walking shells onto target with methodical precision, and they were everywhere. The German response to this artillery dominance was necessarily defensive. Units learned to disperse, to move only at night, to shelter in buildings and forests where overhead observation was difficult. But these adaptations came with their own costs. Dispersed units were harder to coordinate. Night movement was slow and exhausting. Static positions invited the very artillery fire they were meant to avoid. The Germans found themselves trapped in a tactical paradox. Every measure Meyer's Panther tanks survived that January barrage, but the experience marked him as profoundly as any physical wound. In the weeks that followed, as his unit retreated across Germany toward battles that everyone knew were delaying the inevitable rather than preventing it, he found himself flinching at sounds that reminded him of that approaching thunder. The rumble of distant trucks, the low drone of aircraft, even thunder itself, natural and harmless, could send his heart racing and his hands reaching for cover that often didn't exist. He was not alone in this response. Combat fatigue, shell shock, battle exhaustion. The condition had many names, none quite adequate to describe the psychological weight of sustained artillery bombardment. German medical records from the final months of the war documented sharp increases in cases of psychological breakdown, particularly among units that had experienced intensive American artillery fire. Soldiers reported nightmares, auditory hallucinations, paralysis when exposed to loud noises. Some simply stopped responding to orders, their capacity for fear exhausted by oversaturation. The Wehrmacht, which had prided itself on the mental toughness of its soldiers, found that no amount of training or ideological conviction could fully immunize men against the psychological effects of industrial-scale bombardment. But the impact of American artillery extended beyond the psychological. It fundamentally altered the tactical calculus of warfare on the Western Front. German commanders planning operations had to account for the near certainty of artillery response to any movement. Attack plans required elaborate deception efforts to prevent American observers from identifying the main thrust. Defensive positions had to be constructed with overhead protection against airburst shells. Supply routes had to factor in the time required to clear roads of craters and debris. The simple act of concentrating forces for an attack, the basic prerequisite of offensive warfare, became an invitation to devastating fire. This tactical constraint intersected with Germany's deteriorating strategic position to create a death spiral of military effectiveness. Units that were under strength and poorly supplied could not execute complex maneuvers. Simplified tactics were easier for American observers to detect and easier for American artillery to disrupt. Failed attacks further depleted units, making subsequent operations even more difficult. And through it all, the American guns fired with mechanical regularity, each barrage representing resources that Germany could not match and could not counter. The M114 155 howitzer that fired the shells Meyer heard that January day was an unremarkable weapon by the standards of technical innovation. Its design was conventional. Its range was adequate but not exceptional. Its shell, weighing 95 pounds, was devastating but not uniquely so. What made the M114 fearsome was not its individual characteristics, but its integration into a system that maximized its effectiveness. Paired with forward observers, coordinated through fire direction centers, supplied by a logistics network of staggering capacity, and employed by doctrine that emphasized responsiveness and volume, the M114 became something greater than the sum of its parts. This was the fundamental difference between American and German approaches to military technology. Germany produced weapons of extraordinary individual capability. The Tiger tank with its powerful gun and heavy armor, the Me-262 jet fighter with its revolutionary engines, the V-2 rocket with its unprecedented range. These weapons represented the cutting edge of military technology, achievements of engineering that demanded respect even from their enemies. But they were produced in insufficient numbers, required specialized maintenance, and often proved too complex for field conditions. They were weapons designed for a war of quality over quantity, for battles where superior technology could compensate for numerical inferiority. America produced weapons of adequate individual capability in overwhelming numbers. The M4 Sherman tank was inferior to the Panther in gun power and armor protection, but America built 50,000 of them. The M114 howitzer was conventional in design, but America deployed thousands to Europe, each supplied with mountains of ammunition and integrated into a fire control system that multiplied their effectiveness. American aircraft were often less technically sophisticated than their German counterparts, but they filled the skies in such numbers that technical inferiority became tactically irrelevant. This abundance was not accidental. It was the product of an industrial economy mobilized for war with an efficiency that proved as important as any battlefield innovation. While German factories struggled with shortages of raw materials and relied on slave labor that sabotaged production when possible, American factories operated at full capacity, with willing workers who saw their labor as patriotic contribution. While German logistics networks collapsed under Allied bombing and partisan attacks, American supply lines stretched from factories in Detroit and Pittsburgh across the Atlantic to dumps in France and Belgium without meaningful interruption. While German commanders rationed ammunition and fuel, American units sometimes complained of having too much material to effectively manage. For Klaus Meyer, these systemic differences manifested as the sound of thunder approaching, as the methodical destruction of his world by an enemy he could not see or effectively fight. But the thunder represented more than mere firepower. It represented a democracy at war, a society that had organized its productive capacity for a single purpose and achieved a synergy between industrial might and military effectiveness that authoritarian Germany could not match. The symbolism was inescapable to those who looked for it. American abundance in artillery fire mirrored American abundance in food, in equipment, in every material aspect of war. German soldiers who captured American supplies were astonished by the contents of American ration packs: chocolate, cigarettes, canned goods of variety and quality that exceeded what many German civilians saw. American prisoners of war were often better fed than their guards. American vehicles, even when destroyed, contained spare parts and tools that German units salvaged and repurposed. Every interaction with American materiel reinforced the same message. You are fighting an enemy that possesses resources you cannot hope to match. This material disparity carried ideological weight. Nazi propaganda had portrayed democracy as weak and decadent, capitalism as chaotic and inefficient, racial diversity as a source of social dissolution. Yet here was democratic, capitalist, multiracial America demonstrating organizational capacity and industrial efficiency that made German achievements seem provincial by comparison. The cognitive dissonance was profound for soldiers who had been raised on narratives of Aryan superiority and the supposed vitality of authoritarian systems. How could the mongrel Americans be winning if German racial and ideological superiority was real? Some German soldiers resolved this dissonance by attributing American success to numerical advantage alone, dismissing quality in favor of quantity as if the two were unrelated. Others focused on individual tactical victories, small-scale successes that allowed them to maintain pride in German martial prowess even as the strategic situation collapsed. Still others simply stopped thinking about the larger picture, focusing on survival day by day, battle by battle. But for soldiers like Meyer, exposed repeatedly to demonstrations of American capability that went beyond mere numbers, the old certainties became difficult to maintain. The Ardennes barrage was not Meyer's last exposure to American artillery. In February, his depleted unit was assigned to defensive positions along the Rhine. The Americans were approaching the river, the last major natural obstacle before the heart of Germany. Every bridge, every ford, every potential crossing point became the focus of desperate German defense. And every defensive position came under American artillery fire with a regularity that seemed almost scheduled. Meyer learned to identify American fire missions by their characteristics: harassment and interdiction fire, random shells fired at intervals to prevent rest and disrupt movement; preparatory bombardments, intensive barrages that preceded American attacks; counter-battery fire, American shells targeting German artillery positions with a speed that suggested the Americans could see the German guns the moment they fired. Each type of mission represented a different application of the same underlying capability: the American ability to put steel on target with precision and abundance. The psychological impact accumulated like physical wounds: sleep deprivation from constant harassment fire, hypervigilance from the knowledge that any moment could bring sudden death, survivors' guilt as friends and comrades were killed by shells that arrived without warning. The German military machine that had conquered most of Europe was being ground down not primarily by enemy infantry or tanks, but by artillery fire delivered from beyond visual range, by an enemy that seemed to possess unlimited ammunition and absolute confidence in its own superiority. In early March, Meyer's unit received orders for a counterattack, a desperate attempt to disrupt American forces preparing to cross the Rhine. The attack was planned for dawn, with remaining German tanks and infantry to strike American forward positions before artillery could respond. It was the kind of aggressive action that German military doctrine favored: speed, shock, and close combat, where German tactical skill could offset American material advantage. But the plan relied on achieving surprise, on moving faster than American observation and communication networks could respond. The attack failed in its first minutes. As German tanks emerged from their concealed positions, American artillery fire began falling with immediate precision. Not reconnaissance fire, not speculative targeting, but accurate, intensive bombardment that suggested the Americans had known about the attack before it began. Meyer's Panther managed to advance 200 meters before shells began landing around it with the measured precision he had learned to dread. The company commander radioed orders to scatter, to break off the attack, to return to defensive positions. Of 12 tanks that began the attack, 7 made it back. The others burned or sat immobilized, testimony to American fire control and the futility of attacking an enemy that could see everything and respond instantly. Later, Meyer would learn that American aircraft had spotted the German tank concentration during assembly, that American forward observers had pre-registered artillery on likely German attack routes, that the entire sector was under such intensive surveillance that German movement was detected almost immediately. But such knowledge would come later. In the moment, crouched in his tank as American shells methodically destroyed his unit's combat power, he experienced only the immediate reality. The thunder had arrived, and there was no escape. The Rhine crossings, when they came, demonstrated the full scope of American artillery capability. For weeks, American guns had been registered on every German defensive position within range of the river. When American infantry began crossing in late March, they did so under an artillery umbrella that suppressed German defensive fire with overwhelming volume. German machine gun positions that revealed themselves by firing were destroyed within minutes. German mortar crews that attempted to disrupt the crossing found themselves targeted by counter-battery fire of devastating accuracy. German reserves attempting to counterattack found themselves subjected to barrages that destroyed unit cohesion before tanks could even engage American bridgeheads. Meyer's unit, by then reduced to 4 operational tanks, was ordered to counterattack an American crossing site. They never reached their objective. American artillery caught them on the approach march, destroying 2 tanks and forcing the survivors to shelter in a village that was itself systematically demolished by American fire over the following hours. When the barrage finally lifted, Meyer and his crew emerged to find their Panther immobilized by track damage and the village reduced to rubble. They abandoned the tank and retreated on foot, part of a flood of German soldiers withdrawing eastward ahead of American forces, whose advance was paced not by resistance but by logistics. The war's final weeks were a blur of retreat and dissolution. Meyer's unit ceased to exist as a coherent formation, its survivors absorbed into improvised battle groups that fought scattered, delaying actions without strategic purpose. Through it all, the sound of American artillery provided a constant backdrop, sometimes distant, sometimes terrifyingly close, always present. The thunder had become the soundtrack of defeat, a constant reminder of the disparity between German capabilities and American abundance. When Meyer finally surrendered to American forces in April 1945, it was almost a relief. The constant fear, the psychological weight of knowing that death could arrive without warning from beyond the horizon, these burdens lifted the moment he raised his hands and walked toward American lines. He expected perhaps to feel shame at his surrender. Instead, he felt something closer to exhaustion. He had survived. That was enough. In American prisoner of war camps, Meyer encountered the same abundance that had characterized American artillery. Regular meals, medical care, cigarettes distributed freely. It was the abundance of a nation that could afford to treat even its enemies with a generosity that would have been incomprehensible to German forces struggling with shortages of basic supplies. The same systematic efficiency that had characterized American fire control manifested in camp administration, in logistics, in every aspect of how Americans organized and managed large-scale operations. Years later, historians would analyze the effectiveness of American artillery in the European theater with statistical precision. They would note that artillery caused the majority of German casualties in the war's final year. They would document the evolution of fire control techniques, the impact of proximity fuses, the integration of air and artillery observation. They would graph the expenditure of ammunition, the number of tubes deployed, the calculated tons of explosive delivered per square kilometer. These analyses would reduce Meyer's experience to data points, to evidence in arguments about military effectiveness and resource allocation. But for the men who lived through those barrages, who felt the earth shake and heard the thunder approaching, the statistics could never fully capture the experience. They couldn't convey the visceral fear of knowing that death could arrive without warning. They couldn't describe the psychological weight of fighting an enemy that seemed to possess unlimited resources and absolute confidence in its ability to destroy anything it chose to target. They couldn't explain how the sound of American guns became synonymous with inevitability, with the grinding certainty of defeat against an opponent that could afford to expend materiel with a lavishness that seemed almost casual in its excess. The thunder that Klaus Meyer heard approaching that January day in the Ardennes was more than artillery fire. It was the sound of American industrial democracy at war, of a society that had mobilized its productive capacity and organizational genius for a single purpose. It was the sound of abundance weaponized, of quantity transformed into its own quality through systematic application and doctrinal innovation. It was the sound of a different kind of warfare, one where victory came not from superior tactics or individual heroism, but from the patient application of overwhelming resources guided by mathematical precision. In the end, the artillery barrages that German soldiers experienced were not merely military operations. They were demonstrations of a fundamental truth about modern industrial warfare. That material abundance, properly organized and systematically applied, could overcome tactical excellence and ideological conviction. The Wehrmacht had been a formidable fighting force, its soldiers trained and disciplined, its officers tactically skilled. But no amount of skill or determination could overcome the simple mathematics of American firepower. For every German shell fired, American gunners fired dozens. For every German gun, Americans deployed multiple tubes. For every German calculation of firing data, American fire direction centers computed solutions with mechanical speed. The men who heard that thunder and survived carried with them a lesson that transcended military doctrine. They had encountered a democracy at war and discovered that democratic societies, when fully mobilized, possess strengths that authoritarian systems could not match. The abundance that Nazi ideology had dismissed as decadent waste proved to be a strategic asset of decisive importance. The diversity that propaganda had portrayed as weakness turned out to enable the organizational flexibility and innovation that characterized American military effectiveness. The industrial capitalism that was supposed to collapse under the strain of total war instead demonstrated productive capacity beyond anything the autarkic German economy could achieve. Klaus Meyer returned to Germany after the war, to a nation that had been taught a similar lesson in abundance through strategic bombing and military occupation. The thunder he had heard in the Ardennes echoed in every shattered German city, in every demonstration of American logistical capability, in every comparison between devastated Germany and prosperous America. The artillery that had destroyed his world with precision and surplus had been merely the tactical expression of a larger truth. That freedom and abundance were not signs of weakness but sources of strength. That democracy could organize for war with an efficiency that totalitarianism could not match. That the future belonged not to those who could do more with less, but to those who had built societies capable of producing more than enough for everyone. The thunder faded. The wars ended, but the lesson remained, written in the shattered forests of the Ardennes and the rubble of German cities, carried in the memories of men who had heard American guns and understood, finally, what they were truly fighting against. Not merely an army, but a civilization. Not merely firepower, but the organized might of